Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. This will be part 17, chapters 27 and 28. Chapter 27. When he returned, laptop in hand, Shoto and Kachan were leaning in toward each other, talking in hushed tones. He could only see Shoto's face on his approach, his expression curious and serious as he listened to whatever Katsuki had to say. He raised an eyebrow when, as Shoto caught sight of him, his mouth snapped shut. He leaned back in his chair as Izuku approached. Apparently, Kachan was enlisting Shoto in whatever he'd been plotting. Despite his curiosity, he let it lie. Katsuki would tell him when he was ready. It clearly had something to do with him, and if Katsuki was planning it, it was probably benign. Unless he was plotting to replace all his human-rated spices with demon-rated spices again. Somehow he doubted that Shoto would help with that, since he'd been gotten by a similar prank when they were still in school. Katsuki turned to look at him, impatient as though he hadn't just been scheming. "Hurry the fuck up," he barked. "So impatient," Izuku sighed. "And so rude, ordering me around in my own home." He settled back into the space beside Katsuki, opening his laptop on the coffee table. The free time that hadn't been taken up by friends who were determined to distract him had been filled with endless scrolling through auction sites, his spreadsheet in one window and collector forums in another. "If he was looking for the support showcase set, he probably would have stumbled across some of the early Bronze Age stuff," Katsuki said. Izuku nodded, and Katsuki leaned in close to watch the screen as he sorted his spreadsheet. Shoto pushed off the armchair and came to sit beside them, watching attentively as Izuku scrolled through photos. They found a few that Shoto might have seen, maybe not the exact ones he'd lost, but similar and worth reaching out for. A few of the vintage comic books, a few of his pins, and a few action figures. Shoto wasn't sure if they were the exact models, but hope bloomed anyway. It was something, at least. Maybe he could recomplete his pin sets. Maybe the Golden Age art pin set he treated himself to when he'd cracked the top 10. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes at the thought of it, sad and hopeful in equal measure. "Cry, baby," Katsuki muttered, even as he slung his arm back over Izuku's shoulders. "Get your shit together. You're about to have guests. Chargebolt will have a meltdown if you're crying when he gets here." Izuku nodded, but his lips trembled anyway. Tenki had been very emotional about Izuku's emotions lately. It didn't help that Izuku cried no matter what large emotion he was feeling, whether it was extreme sadness or extreme happiness. He got himself under control eventually, more focused on finding his collection than on the excitement he felt at the possibility of getting it back. He was relaxing into Shoto's presence too. It felt good to have him back, even if the nerves were still raw from the open wound he'd unintentionally left. It felt like slipping into your favorite shirt, worn and soft and comfortable. Familiar, down to the thread count. The doorbell rang again, and Katsuki got up, taking his heat with him so he could answer the door. Izuku stayed with Shoto, chatting about the few pieces he had managed to recover in those first few weeks. "A was lucky to find them," Hata said as he entered, flopping into the vacated armchair and propping his feet on the coffee table. Denki sauntered in after him, Hitoshi a few steps behind. They were carrying snacks and booze, and Katsuki was scowling at their food and beverage choices. If Izuku had to guess, he was pissy about the empty calories for the snacks and the shitty quality of the beer. Denki had never quite outgrown his cheap beer for fast buzz phase. Despite having more than enough money to buzz with craft brews, it was a charming, if not somewhat déclassé, affection. Katsuki, a self-proclaimed man of taste, refused to drink anything that you might find in an American frat house. Izuku was somewhere between the two of them. It felt like his heart filled as his house did, surrounding him with the people who cared about him, and celebrated in his victories, no matter what those victories were. It was loud and boisterous, filled with life and laughter and care. For a moment he wondered if this was what Ochako had been after, if he'd made their space too quiet and closed off, and it had driven her to extremes. But with adequate preparation, they could have done this. All it would have taken was locking down the merch room. It's not like they hadn't done it before. He was glad they were here, filling his heart as it bled so that he'd never run dry. Mina and Eijiro arrived last. It was a massive relief to see Eijiro up and walking, even though his movements were slow and fatigued. Izuku got up as they walked in, hugging them both. Eijiro flinched at the movement in his shoulder, still sensitive in and around his rotator cuff. He tried not to notice the way Eijiro's muscles had atrophied from his hospital stay. It was slight, but Izuku had always had an eye for detail, and analysis was a hard habit to put away. "It's good to see you," Izuku said, pulling back. Eijiro gave him a blinding smile. "You say that as though you didn't visit me daily in the hospital," he teased. "I thought you would have chilled out when I threw that lamp at you." "You've been out of the hospital for a while now," Izuku pointed out, "and Mina's been hogging you." Because you three always end up roughhousing, and I'm a firm but fair warden, Mina said, breezing past them and beelining toward the crappy beer. You couldn't have gotten something that doesn't taste like alcoholic piss water? She sighed. It all tastes the same once you're drunk enough. Denki grinned, rolling her eyes. She grabbed one bottle for the both of them. She's been staying dry in solidarity, Eijiro said quietly so that only Izuku could hear him. I think a few drinks would have helped her with my bitching, though. There was so much love and warmth in his voice, and it made Izuku feel positively gooey. He was so glad that they had each other. He was so glad Mina hadn't lost him. I think she's just glad you're still around to complain, he said, nudging him gently. Eijiro's face took on a somber note. That makes two of us. You better not still be blaming yourself for that shit, though, he warned. Izuku raised his hands in surrender. That's what I thought. Don't push me. I haven't had a good fight in almost a month. Mina was making her way back to them now, and apparently Shoto had decided to face the confrontation early. He and Eijiro both fell silent as he stood, stepping over Hanta's outstretched legs to skirt the coffee table. He looked nervous as he approached, especially when Mina turned to fix her gaze on him. Izuku understood. Mina was a force to be reckoned with on a good day. There had been a lot of bad days lately. Hi, he said once he was standing in front of them. Sho, Mina greeted him. In his periphery, Izuku saw Katsuki coming toward them. He was glad. Hopefully he'd have help if they needed to diffuse conflict. He always felt a bit better, with Katan watching his back. How are you feeling? He asked Eijiro. The redhead was uncharacteristically terse, face stony as he replied. Well, I can't work for 2 months, he said, tone uncomfortably cool. I can't raise my arm above my shoulder level, but otherwise I'm fine. Mina placed a hand on Eijiro's shoulder. We're doing better, Shoto. Thanks for asking. I'm so sorry, he said, averting his eyes. This wouldn't have happened if... Ochako hadn't thrown out the notebooks, Mina interrupted. You didn't have anything to do with that. You hurt Mito, but since you're here, I'm guessing he's forgiven you. Shoto snuck a glance at Izuku, surprised to find him smiling. What? She's right. A knows it too, she huffed, pinching her fiancé's side. He's just being pissy because he keeps overworking his rehab. Fucking dumbass, Katsuki muttered. Eijiro punched him, then winced. I don't blame you, Eijiro offered. Not for this, Mina's right. But you know better now, right? Because all this shit could have been avoided if you just talked to Mito. We've already talked about it, Izuku assured him. Eijiro nodded. Fine. Then it's all good. His heart ached as he watched Shoto's face crumple in relief. It had taken him so long to open up to people, to really let them in and trust them. It must have hurt so much to know that he'd been lied to know that his trust had been broken, and as a result, the people he loved didn't trust him. He was glad that he'd had Momo to push him in the right direction, to get him moving so that he could find ways to rebuild his bridges. He could feel the fractures healing. Sure, there were gaps, massive tears in the fabric that had been left by dishonesty and betrayal, but his friends, their friends, were working overtime to fill them, weaving their lives back together in the wake of pain and destruction. Hanta, get your ass out of my seat, Eijiro barked. Evidently he was ready to move on. Frankly, Izuku was grateful. The longer they dwelled on the bad things, the more they'd fester. Hanta frowned at him. You were late, dude. You don't get dibs. I'm rehabbing serious injuries and I'm tired as shit. Give me that seat. Sit on the couch. You sit on the couch. Mina looked at them, expression deadpan, as though her soul had aged 1,000 years in a single minute. Men, she uttered, an indictment toward the entire gender. Izuku snorted in amusement as Katsuki snickered, turning toward the bickering duo. Hey, dipshits 1 and 2, he barked at them. They whipped around to scowl at him. If Dictate gives up the armchair, we can grab the beanbag chair from the guest room. Everyone knew that Hanta was a sucker for beanbag chairs. Pouting like a petulant child, Hanta said, Fine. Once everyone was seated to their preference, and after a significant bout of tug-of-war over the beanbag between Denki and Hanta, Katsuki trudged toward the kitchen. Izuku frowned, following after him. What are you doing? He asked as Katsuki pulled out the pans. Katsuki looked over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow to Izuku like he was stupid. What do you usually do with your pans? He drawled. Izuku rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. You're cooking. Why are you cooking? He demanded. Katsuki smirked before turning to the stove. It's a celebration, he replied noncommittally. And you like my cooking best. You've said so like 2 million fucking times. Izuku floundered. It's not that Kacchan didn't do nice things for him, but usually it was when it was just him. Or the entire class. All or nothing. There are 8 people here. I can't ask you to... You didn't ask, Katsuki barked. And I don't mind cooking for the idiots as long as you're one of them, all right? Izuku flushed, smiling delightedly. That was sweet. The tips of Katsuki's ears were red again. He was still embarrassed about doing nice things, and it was cute that he did them anyway. All right, Kacchan. Despite everything, he was lucky. After all, Kacchan was at his side, a constant show of steady love and support. He only hoped that he could keep him there. Chapter 28. Izuku stepped out of the agency doors and into the sunlight, clad in his hero costume for the first time in months. The past few weeks had been harrowing, but underneath it all was an undercurrent of hope, that optimistic feeling that things were finally getting better, that despite everything that had come for him, bearing him under stress and strain, he was finally coming out the other side. But the fact that he was making progress didn't make the journey any less tiring. Of all the energy-draining, soul-sucking activities he'd been forced to endure, the court proceedings were probably the hardest. They were ugly and gut-wrenching, not just for himself, but for the families of the fallen heroes and civilians as well. Izuku had spent an astonishing amount of time in court over the past few weeks, both in his own proceedings against his ex-wife and as a witness in both civil and criminal proceedings. It felt like he'd spent more time talking about the failures in his marriage than the marriage itself had lasted. Excluding his own lawsuits, Ochako was being tried for 7 counts of negligent homicide, criminal negligence, and various damages ranging from emotional distress and mental anguish to medical bills to loss of financial contribution for families who'd lost loved ones. It seemed that as time went on, the longer the list of plaintiffs against Ochako seemed to grow. He'd wondered more than once if his own charges were just beating a dead horse, until Katsuki reminded him that the point wasn't to bring her down, it was to build himself back up. His resolve had only solidified after Ochako's first guilty verdict, in which she was held responsible for the distribution of classified information. Half an hour after the verdict had passed, Ochako's lawyer had reached out to his. She's asking for a meeting, Fujiwara said over the phone, sounding skeptical. Tomorrow at 10. What does she want? Izuku asked. His phone was face up on the kitchen counter, on speaker while he cooked. Doesn't fucking matter, Katsuki barked, making the curry while Izuku fried pork. We're not fucking going. You're not actually invited, Fujiwara drawled. No way in fuck am I going to let him deal with that bitch alone. Regardless, neither of you are obligated to be there, especially since her lawyer doesn't even know what she wants to talk about, Fujiwara said, as though Katsuki hadn't interrupted. Chances are that she'll ask you to settle civil suits out of court. Personally, I think it's worth hearing. She'll still be tried for criminal charges, and you might be able to cut down the amount of agonizing trial time. There's no way we're letting that bitch off easy. It's not about letting her off easy, Fujiwara interrupted, cutting Kacchan's rant off at the knees. It's about letting Midoriya off easy. Besides, it depends on what she's offering. And if she tries to pressure Midoriya into lightening the charges or dropping them completely, we can use that as a character evidence against her. By that point, the trials had already been running him into the ground, between the utter ruin these families were in and the complete betrayal that had caused it. Every moment he spent in the courthouse was painful and disheartening. I think it's a waste of time, Katsuki said, turning to face him. But if you want to hear her out, I'm going to be there. She's done enough damage. I don't give a shit what anyone says. You're not doing this shit alone. If all of this turmoil had taught him anything, it was that, no matter what life threw at him, Kacchan would be there for him. Made him want to smile and cry all at once. I'll hear her out, he said. But I want to figure out minimum settlements. Katsuki gave him a mischievous, approving smile. That way she can't try to lowball me. If she wants to settle, she'll settle my way. Look at you, taking your own spine out of the closet for yourself for once. Katsuki snickered. Izuku kicked him in the shin. That night, Katsuki had actually gone home for the evening, something that had only been happening about once a week lately. Apparently, he wanted to look intimidating, and he couldn't do that using Izuku's nerdy t-shirts and too tight jeans. The next morning, he showed up at Izuku's door with his favorite complicated coffee order and a box full of luxuriously complex pastries. You didn't have to do this, Izuku told him, even as he set his greedy sights on a beautiful millefeuille. Your day's going to be shitty, he shrugged, placing the box on the counter. I figured you could start it off right so that you're not miserable all day. I even had them give your salted caramel mocha some extra whipped cream. Izuku's heart turned over in his chest. Katsuki was letting him ignore his meal plan, even though he wasn't working out enough to justify it. just for something as frivolous as comfort. "Thanks, Kachan," he said, cradling the coffee cup like it was precious. "You're the best." Katsuki scoffed. "Obviously. Now go get dressed, loser. We're going to be late." He had to admit, he was glad that he walked into that meeting with caffeine in hand and Katsuki at his side, both of them sporting suits and ties. It was the first time he'd been this close to Ochako since the day he'd come home from his mission. At least, the closest he'd been outside of a courtroom. Here, she looked tired and upset, and he had to push down the part of himself that felt bad for her. It helped that Katsuki had positioned himself in front of him, a shield against his ex-wife and a container for his pity. "Why is he here?" she asked, gesturing at Katsuki with a hint of a sneer in her tone. It raised Izuku's defenses off the bat, jaw clenching as his grip tightened on his coffee cup. "He's here because he knows what I'm like," Izuku said, tone colder than he'd intended. "And he knows what I want. He'll make sure that I don't set myself on fire to keep you warm. He's been my moral support through all of this. Why are you here?" Now, Fujiwara said, cutting in. "Have a seat, both of you. Gentlemen, this is Uraraka's defense attorney," he said, emphasizing Ochako's lost hero name as he introduced them. Her lawyer was a squirrely-looking man who seemed shrewd but harmless. Izuku shook his hand. Katsuki didn't. Instead, he stared at the offered appendage like it was personally insulting to him. Izuku bit back a laugh. Ochako's lawyer dropped his hand a moment later, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "Thank you both for coming. Miss Uraraka wishes to—" "Just a moment, if you don't mind," Fujiwara interrupted. He pulled papers from his briefcase, sliding them across the table a moment later. "If all parties could please sign these waivers before we get started, that would be excellent." Ochako's lawyer snatched the offending document off the table, scanning it quickly. "Authorization to record?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "What for?" "For our records," Fujiwara explained, calm smile fixed on his face. "You understand. We'd like to ensure that all details of the meeting are captured accurately." "I'm not going to consent to being recorded," Ochako said firmly. "You could misconstrue what I say here, and if there's any private information, I don't want to risk it being released." Katsuki snarled. "Oh, now you're worried about leaking private information?" Fujiwara held up a hand to silence him. This was his job, after all. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ease your concerns," he said, voice as sweet as a pit viper. "First, if you're planning to behave in a civilized manner, being misconstrued shouldn't be an issue. Second, there's a clause in the waiver detailing how the recordings will be stored and disposed of. I'd also provide a copy to your lawyer before we even leave the room. Finally, no meeting will take place unless you agree to the recording. This is one of the most contentious divorces I've ever seen, and I have a duty to protect my client. Now, would you like to continue, or shall we leave?" he said, smile staying even as he offered her the pen. "Mr. Midoriya is within his rights to leave at any time," Ochako's lawyer advised. "If you want to negotiate, you're beholden to his restrictions regarding the parameters of the meeting." Her face twisted like she'd tasted something sour, but she snatched the pen from Fujiwara's outstretched hand. Izuku and Katsuki both signed a moment later, the former suppressing a satisfied smirk, and the latter wearing it with feral pride. The lawyers went last. Then Fujiwara placed his phone on the table to record. He had them each state their names for the record before they began, and Izuku noted the reluctance in Ochako's voice as she complied. "Now," Fujiwara said, smiling placidly, "why did you call this meeting, Miss Uraraka?" All eyes turned to her. Even her own lawyer looked curious. She raised her eyes to meet Izuku's. There were dark circles under her eyes. "We're both adults," she said, stiff in her seat. "I think we've done each other enough harm, and I'd like to get this over with quickly. I think we can resolve all of our issues out of court." Katsuki scoffed, but Izuku silenced him, placing a hand on his knee under the table. "I'm willing to negotiate the civil matters, but the criminal charges are out of my hands, and frankly, I don't want to see you walk away from them." "Izuku, please," she implored him. "Let's get this over with, here, without the drawn-out trials and the over-the-top retribution." "People are dead because of what you did, Ochako," he snapped. "I'm willing to settle for the personal theft and property damage complaints, but you can't sweet-talk your way out of malicious negligence. I'm being generous." "You're being high and mighty," she snapped back. "You've already thrown me under the bus and made me look like a controlling, careless bitch. I've already lost everything. If you ever loved me—" "Hold on," Katsuki interrupted. He didn't sound angry. He sounded incredulous. "Are you asking him to drop the charges? Completely. Just walk away from all the shit you pulled?" Izuku tightened his grip on the blonde's knee, but Kachan paid him no mind. This doesn't concern you, Bakugo, she sighed. It never has. You constantly enable him and goad him to go overboard. If you're going to be here, shut up and let us handle this maturely. It does concern me, he drawled. He still didn't look angry. Now he looked amused. I've been there to fix what you broke, remember? You tried to ruin him for something you did. Not only that, you stole his shit, things that he can't replace, and sold it for less than an eighth of their value. You haven't even apologized. Instead, you manipulated his friends into destroying shit that mattered to him. When it didn't work the way you wanted, you tried to convince the public that he was unhinged, to the point where it was dangerous for him to perform his duties as a hero. You want to talk about maturity? Why don't you take a look in the Kachan. Izuku cut him off. Katsuki fell silent. He turned to Ochako. I did love you. I loved the you I thought I knew, at least. But the you that you are, that you've decided to be, I pity you. You're going to end up miserable and alone because you ruined everything you had by trying to warp it to fit your expectations. I tried to be mature and civil. I wanted a quiet divorce and to recoup some of my losses. You're the one who took it public and tried to ruin me. You're the one who threw classified information in the recycling instead of disposing it properly because you didn't want to make the extra effort. So no, I won't be dropping the charges, criminal or otherwise. Izuku, Midoriya, he interrupted her. You're a stranger to me now. And when this is all over, I'm going to do everything in my power to never think of you again. He dug in his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. This is the minimum settlement I'm willing to accept. It has itemized damages in case you're confused about the number. I'm not going to go lower. Either pay the settlement or take your chances in court. Katsuki's hand found his under the table, squeezing it tight. It was amazing how much that simple gesture conveyed. Pride, comfort, and support, all conveyed in his burning grip. The anger left him shaky. Katsuki kept him steady. Izuku didn't know if he'd been able to do this if he wasn't here to back him up. Story of his life, to be honest. You're being unreasonable, she told him. And you're going to lose. They only sided with you when the attacks happened. They agreed with me until then. Grow up. Izuku gave her a tight smile. They agreed with you because you lied to them. They know the truth now, he said. He stood from the table, straightening his jacket. I'm sure your lawyer will agree the settlements I'm willing to make are a way better deal than you'll get if a judge rules in my favor. I don't want to destroy you. I just want to rebuild my own life. If you really want to handle this maturely, take the deal. Can you handle the rest, Fujiwara? Katsuki asked, deep voice, smug and satisfied. Of course, he agreed. Sorry for wasting your time, gentlemen. I'll contact you with anything pertinent. Kick ass, Katsuki grinned, clapping Izuku on the back. We've got shitloads of agency paperwork to deal with, he said. If you need us, you know where to find us. Izuku had let himself get steered out of the conference room, Katsuki's hand gripping his shoulder. When it was done, when he'd said what he needed to say, he'd felt drained. Shocked, really, that he'd let himself be so bitter, even if it was civil. He was grateful that Katsuki was there to steer him because he was busy replaying the whole thing over again in his head, days that he'd found so much strength in his own spine. He wasn't a pushover, but he was forgiving. But he didn't forgive her, not even close. He was broken out of his trance when Katsuki shut the car door, climbing into the driver's seat and grinning at him, wide and wild. You kicked ass in there, he declared. A helpless smile tugged at the corner of his own lips. I did, didn't I? Fuck yeah. Want to celebrate? He asked, ruffling Izuku's hair. His smile was so fond that it made Izuku feel like he was in free fall. His stomach swooped and his heart was racing, and he wasn't sure if it was because Kachan was, well, Kachan, or the adrenaline of the confrontation. Sure, he chuckled. It came out as a crazed giggle. What did you have in mind? What had followed made Izuku feel spoiled rotten. Katsuki had taken him to get crepes, and they'd eaten them on the rooftop of their agency, doing paperwork in the early afternoon sun. He'd ordered noodles from Izuku's favorite restaurant for lunch. Then, they spent the entire evening watching movies, pandering to Izuku's obsession with pre-quirk media while eating homemade katsudon. It felt over the top, but Izuku hadn't been stupid enough to complain. He let himself forget about Ochako, instead choosing to revel in the strange and aggressive TLC that Kachan was heaping onto him. Katsuki had been proud of him before. He'd even said it out loud once or twice, but something about this felt different. It was a giddy sort of elation and vindication that was confusing but contagious. It wasn't all positive, though. Like he'd said, the past few weeks had been exhausting. A tumultuous roller coaster. Sure, the light at the end of the tunnel is in his sights, but there was so much left to be done. All right, listeners. This concludes Chapter 28 of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. Chapter 29 will be next. We're nearing the end of this fic, because this fic contains 33 chapters in total. I hope you all are still enjoying. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.